Towards a New Socialism. Section. Planning in the USSR. Two sorts of questions suggest themselves at this point, concerning the relationship between the argument we have just been through and the experience of planning in the Soviet Union. First, one might ask, if the calculations required for consistent detailed planning are so vast and complex, how on earth did the Soviets manage before high-speed computers were available? In fact, it is rather remarkable that the Soviets should have been so successful during the pre-computer days of the 1930s in building up their heavy industrial base using centralized planning methods. The economy was, of course, much less technologically complex at that time, and the plans specified relatively few key targets. And even so, there are many tales of gross mismatches between supply and demand during the period of the early 5-year plans. A huge expansion of the inputs of labor and materials meant that the key targets could be met despite such imbalances. In addition, we should note that the early Soviet plans were not drawn up in the way we have described. Working backwards from a target list of final outputs to the required list of gross outputs, consistently and in detail, was quite beyond the capacity of the Gosplan, the state planning agency. Often, instead, the planners started out from targets that were themselves set in gross terms. So many tons of steel by 1930, so many tons of coal by 1935, and so on. This early experience arguably had a deleterious effect on the economic mechanism in later years. It gave rise to a sort of productionism, in which the generation of bumper outputs of key intermediate industrial products came to be seen as an end in itself. In fact, from an input-output point of view, one really wants to economize on intermediate goods so far as possible. The aim should be to produce the minimum amounts of coal, steel, cement, etc., consistent with the desired volume of final outputs. The second sort of question that arises here is in a sense the reverse of the first. If the mathematical and computational techniques we have discussed are well known, how come the Soviet planners weren't doing much better by the mid-1980s, when fast computers had become available? We have pointed out part of the answer to this in discussing the first question above. The necessarily rather crude planning methods of the 1930s left their mark on the system that evolved in later years. Given the peculiar ideological sclerosis of the late Stalin years, interrupted by the Khrushchev thaw, but then resumed under Brezhnev, new approaches to planning were generally regarded with suspicion. There is a suggestion in the literature on Soviet economics that the very idea of starting the planning process from final output targets, the procedure we have advocated above, was seen by the official guardians of orthodoxy as somehow bourgeois. In addition, interest in novel computer-based planning methods in the USSR came out of phase with the real technological possibilities. The types of computer system available to the Soviet planners in the 1960s and even the 70s, when the improvement of the planning system was a live issue, were primitive by today's Western standards. Soviet economists were well aware of the potential benefits of the use of consistent input-output techniques, but the equipment at their disposal permitted the analysis of only small, highly aggregated input-output systems. While these were of some use for interregional planning exercises, investigating the interdependence of the regions of the USSR, they could not be used for routine, detailed planning. For the most part, input-output analysis remained an academic exercise, and the overall impact of the computer on Soviet planning disappointed the early expectations. It is important to note that the unavailability of superfast central computers was not the only or even the most important constraint. As we explained in Chapter 3, in the context of calculating labor values, it would be possible to accomplish the same results using a large distributed network of much more modest personal computers, linked by an economy-wide telecommunications system. Such equipment was also unavailable in the years when Soviet economists were thinking seriously about improving the planning system. Cheap PCs are a relatively recent development, and besides, the telecommunications system in the USSR is notoriously backwards, as anyone who has tried to make a phone call between Moscow and Leningrad knows. Further, as we shall see in Chapter 9, effective detailed planning requires a standardized system of product identification, which in turn demands sophisticated computer databases. In the USSR, the planners continued to work with the system of so-called material balances. This system, which involved drawing up balance sheets, showing the sources of production and the planned uses for each product individually, represents a sort of crude approximation to the input-output method. Not only were the planners unable to calculate effectively the interactions among these balances, but in addition, the classification of products was incomplete and inconsistent. A political point is also relevant here. Our planning proposals absolutely require a free flow of information and universal access to computer systems, and this was politically impossible in the USSR under Brezhnev. Even access to photocopying equipment was strictly controlled for fear of the dissemination of political dissent. Finally, of course, computerization is no panacea. There are many problems with the economic planning mechanism in the USSR, which would have had to be tackled before the application of extra computer power could be expected to yield much of a dividend. One example, the irrational and semi-fossilized pricing system, with the prices of many goods stuck at levels which guarantee shortages and queues. Effective detailed planning of a complex economy, it would appear, requires the sorts of computers and telecommunication technology available in the West as of, say, the mid-1980s. By this time, however, the ideological climate in the Soviet Union had shifted substantially in favor of market-oriented reforms. It would seem that Soviet economists, or at any rate, those who had the ear of the political leadership under Gorbachev, were little interested in developing the sorts of algorithms and computer systems that we have discussed. They had apparently lost their belief in the potential of efficient planning, perhaps partly in response to an earlier, premature overselling of the benefits of computerization, and partly in response to the trend in favor of free market economics in the West. End of section.